Ethan kept staring at the papers like he'd forgotten how to read. No one moved. His mother still had that smile on her face, small, controlled. The same smile she used at charity events when someone donated less money than expected. The candles between us had almost burned down to the glass. I remember noticing that for some reason. Diane folded her napkin carefully onto her lap. "Well," she said, "I think honesty matters in families." Nobody looked at me. Not Ethan's sister, not her husband, not even Richard, who normally filled silence with nervous jokes whenever things got uncomfortable. I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. Ethan finally looked up. Not at me. At his mother. "Where did you get this done?" Her expression shifted just slightly. "I already told you, a private lab." "That's not what I asked." She blinked once. Then she reached for her wine glass, though it was almost empty already. "I think we're avoiding the real issue here." I sat there with both hands under the table because I could feel them shaking. Our son was upstairs asleep in one of Diane's guest rooms. We'd brought him over after church because Diane insisted on real family dinners twice a month. She liked routines that made her feel important. Nobody said my name. That was the part I remember most. Like I'd already been removed from the room. Ethan looked back down at the papers. Then he said quietly, "Henry's my son." Diane gave a quick little laugh through her nose. "Ethan." "No, he's my son." His voice stayed calm, almost too calm. "But according to this?" He tapped the second page. "Dad might not be mine." The room changed after that. Not loudly. Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up. It was smaller than that. His sister slowly lowered her fork onto her plate. Richard stared at the tablecloth. Diane didn't move at all for maybe 3 seconds. Then she smiled again. Only tighter this time. "These tests can be wrong." Ethan kept reading. "No, not usually." I looked at him then, really looked at him. And suddenly I realized he wasn't surprised enough. That feeling stayed with me the whole night. Like everyone else had gotten pages from a script except me. Diane finally turned toward me for the first time since dessert. "I hope you understand this wasn't personal." I almost laughed. But I didn't. Because the thing about humiliation is, sometimes your body gets very still. "I don't," I said. She inhaled slowly through her nose. Well, certain timelines raised questions. Questions. That word. Like I was an accounting error. Across the table, Ethan rubbed his thumb against the edge of the envelope again and again. A habit he had when he was anxious. I used to think I knew all his habits. 3 months earlier, Diane had invited me shopping for centerpieces for some hospital fundraiser she chaired every spring. That should have warned me something was off. She never invited me anywhere alone unless she needed free labor or an extra body for photographs. We were standing inside a floral showroom in Naperville, while she inspected white orchids like they'd personally offended her. "You still working part-time?" she asked. 3 days now." "Mm-hmm." She adjusted one of the arrangements without looking at me. "I just worry sometimes." "About what?" She smiled lightly. "You're very bright, Claire. It would be a shame if you became too dependent." Dependent. She always found polished words for ugly things. I remember pretending to study candles so I wouldn't roll my eyes. At the time, I thought that was the entire conversation. Now I know she'd already started digging through my life by then. When Ethan and I first got married, I spent almost a year trying to earn Diane's approval without admitting it to myself. I learned which serving dishes she used for holidays. I learned she hated store-bought desserts but pretended not to. I learned she corrected people more gently when rich friends were present. Mostly I learned silence had value in that family. You got rewarded for not making things difficult. Ethan had been raised inside that system so long, he barely noticed it anymore. The first time Diane insulted me in front of him, we were driving home afterward in silence. She'd made a comment about my mother renting instead of owning, Very casual. Very Diane. At a stoplight, I finally said, "Your mom doesn't like me." Ethan sighed like he was already tired. "She likes people who don't react to her." That should have bothered me more than it did. But back then, I still believed patience eventually turned into acceptance. I think a lot of women believe that when they marry into families like his, if you're easy enough, flexible enough, useful enough, eventually they'll let you belong. Back at the dinner table, Diane stood up first. I think everyone's overtired. Nobody stopped her. She carried her plate into the kitchen with perfect posture. I heard the faucet running a minute later. His sister got up next after muttering something about checking on Henry upstairs. Richard followed, because that's what he always did. Followed whoever seemed safest. Then it was just me and Ethan. The candles had nearly gone out. He kept staring at those papers. "You knew?" I asked. His jaw tightened immediately. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Knew what? That she was doing this. She mentioned concerns. I looked at him for a long second. "You let me walk into this house. That's not fair." I nodded slowly. That was another thing people said instead of apologizing. Not fair. Like pain needed legal standards first. From the kitchen, I could hear Diane opening and closing cabinets harder than necessary. Ethan leaned back in his chair and covered his mouth with one hand. I didn't know she'd do it tonight. Tonight. Not deny it. Just the timing. I stared at him. And for the first time since I'd met his family, something inside me went completely quiet. Not anger. Not even shock anymore. Just clarity. Upstairs, Henry started crying. Nobody moved at first. Henry's crying got louder through the ceiling. Still, nobody moved. Ethan sat there with both elbows on the table, pressing his fingers against his forehead, like he could hold the night together if he stayed still enough. From the kitchen, dishes clinked too hard against the sink. Diane was cleaning. That was how she handled panic. I pushed my chair back first. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor, and everybody seemed to hear it at once. Ethan looked up. "I'll get him." I nodded, though I hadn't actually agreed. Upstairs, the hallway light was dimmed low. Diane always kept the guest rooms cold, even in March. Said people slept better that way. Henry was standing in the portable crib crying with one sock half off his foot. The second he saw me, he reached both arms out. That nearly broke me. Not because of what happened downstairs. Because he had no idea any of it was happening. I picked him up and pressed my face into his hair for a second. Baby shampoo, warm skin, real things. Downstairs, I could hear muffled voices starting again. Low, tight. Henry wrapped his fingers into the collar of my sweater while I sat in the rocking chair beside the window. Across the street, one of Diane's neighbors still had Christmas lights hanging from their gutters even though it was March already. White lights. Very neat. I kept staring at them while Henry settled against my chest. After a minute, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked tired suddenly. Older. Not devastated. Just worn down. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I looked at him then. Really looked. His tie loosened. One sleeve slightly wrinkled. The envelope still in his hand. "No," I said. He nodded once like he expected that answer. Then he leaned against the doorframe. "I didn't know she'd ambush you." "You keep saying tonight." "What?" "You keep saying you didn't know she'd do it tonight." He looked away first. Downstairs, I heard Diane laughing softly at something Richard said. That fake social laugh she used when she needed a room to stabilize again. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "She told me she was thinking about doing a test." "When?" "A while ago." "How long is a while?" He hesitated. That tiny pause told me more than the answer. "A few months." I stared at him. Henry shifted sleepily against me. "A few months." She was upset about the trust discussions. I almost didn't understand the sentence at first. The trust. He exhaled slowly. Grandpa structured things weirdly. There are clauses about direct biological descendants. And your mother thought I cheated on you because of money. It's more complicated than that. I laughed once. Not loudly. Just enough to hurt my throat. There it is. What? That sentence your family uses before somebody gets blamed for something. He looked tired again. Claire. No. Don't do that voice right now. What voice? The calm one. Like we're discussing insurance. His mouth closed. Henry had fallen asleep again, one hand still curled into my sweater. Ethan stepped into the room finally. I was trying to handle it. I nodded slowly. By waiting. She's my mother. And I'm your wife. Neither of us said anything after that. The silence between married people is different once disappointment enters it. He sat down in the chair across from me. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say something honest. Then footsteps came up the stairs. Diane. Of course. She stopped outside the doorway first before walking in, probably making sure her expression looked right. I made tea, she said softly. Nobody answered. Her eyes went immediately to Henry. Not me. I didn't mean for him to hear all that. I almost said something sharp. But suddenly I was too tired. Ethan stood up. Mom. No, Ethan, let me speak. She folded her arms tightly across herself. Not defensive exactly. Contained. I know tonight was unpleasant. Unpleasant. Like bad weather. But these situations can become legally complicated later if they aren't addressed early. I stared at her. You thought humiliating me at dinner was addressing it. I thought private conversations had already happened. My eyes moved slowly toward Ethan. He looked away immediately. There it was. Not the whole truth yet. But enough. Diane noticed it too. The room changed again. Very slightly. You told her I asked him. I tried to mention my mother had concerns. That's not what I asked. He didn't answer. Diane inhaled sharply through her nose. Claire, nobody was accusing you of. You mailed my child's DNA to a lab. That finally shut her up. For the first time all evening, she looked embarrassed. Not guilty. Embarrassed. There's a difference. Downstairs, a dishwasher started running. I remember that sound clearly. The normalness of it. Like somewhere in the house, life had already decided to continue. Ethan stepped closer to me. I should have stopped it earlier. Earlier. Again. Not stopped it. Stopped it earlier. I looked down at Henry sleeping against my chest. Then back at my husband. And suddenly, a memory came back so clearly, it almost made me dizzy. 2 summers ago. 4th of July barbecue. Diane standing beside the grill, talking to one of her friends, while I carried lemonade outside. Her friend had smiled at Henry and said, "He doesn't look much like the Bennetts." Diane answered before I could. Well, genetics are funny sometimes. At the time, everybody laughed lightly. Even me. Now I realized Ethan had gone quiet right afterward. He remembered that conversation too. I could see it on his face. How long, I asked quietly, have you been wondering? He opened his mouth. Closed it again. That was my answer. Diane stepped forward carefully. Ethan was under pressure. I looked at her. You don't get to protect him from me right now. Her lips pressed together hard. And suddenly I saw it clearly. The whole structure. This family didn't survive conflict by honesty. They survived by managing reactions, softening language, delaying consequences, keeping everybody just comfortable enough to stay seated at the table. I stood up slowly, still holding Henry. I think I want to go home. Ethan immediately nodded. Too quickly. Like he'd been waiting for permission to leave. Diane's face changed for half a second. Fear. Not about me. About losing control of the room. Claire, she said carefully. "I hope you know I never wanted to hurt you." I adjusted Henry higher against my shoulder. Then I looked directly at her for the first time all night. "I don't think you wanted to know me enough to care if you did." Nobody answered. The ride home took almost an hour, because Ethan missed the expressway exit. He never missed exits. Neither of us mentioned it. Henry slept in the back seat with one shoe missing. I could see his small socked foot in the mirror every few seconds when streetlights passed over the car. Ethan drove with both hands gripping the wheel too tightly. The envelope sat between us on the center console. Folded now. Smaller somehow. At a red light, he finally said, "You should have told me if you felt uncomfortable around my mother." I turned slowly toward him. That sentence actually made me smile a little. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. "You think this started tonight?" "That's not what I said." "No, it's what you meant." He looked back at the road immediately. Outside rain had started lightly against the windshield. Thin little streaks. "I know she can be difficult," he said. Difficult. Another soft word. Like unpleasant, concerns, complicated. His family wrapped sharp things in tissue paper and called it kindness. I leaned my head against the window. When she used to correct how I folded napkins at Thanksgiving, Ethan sighed quietly. "Claire." "No, listen." My voice stayed calm. That surprised me. When she introduced me to her friends as Ethan's wife for 2 years without using my name, he said nothing. When she asked if my mother needed help understanding the country club dress code, that wasn't. She knew exactly what she was doing. The wipers dragged slowly across the windshield. Back and forth. Back and forth. Ethan loosened one hand from the steering wheel finally. I thought if I kept things peaceful, eventually she'd stop. I looked at him. "You mean eventually I'd stop reacting?" That hit him. I could tell. His jaw shifted slightly, and he blinked hard once. But he still didn't argue. That almost made it worse. When Ethan and I got engaged, Diane offered to host a dinner for both families. My mother spent 2 weeks worrying about what to wear. I told her it didn't matter. It mattered. The Bennetts lived in one of those old brick houses where everything looked expensive without trying to. Even the soap in the guest bathroom smelled expensive. My mother brought a homemade pie because showing up empty-handed made her nervous. Diane accepted it with that polished smile. "Oh, how sweet." Then she handed it to the housekeeper without even setting it on the table. I saw my mother notice, but she pretended not to. The whole evening felt like that. Tiny moments. Tiny cuts. My mother laughing too loudly because she was uncomfortable. Diane gently correcting how she pronounced charcuterie. Ethan squeezing my knee under the table afterward and whispering, "Don't overthink it." I spent years mistaking his discomfort for support. By the time we got home, it was almost midnight. Ethan carried Henry upstairs, while I stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing for a while. The dishwasher light glowed blue against the dark room. There were dishes in the sink from breakfast that suddenly felt impossible to deal with. Ethan came downstairs quietly a few minutes later. "She texted me." I didn't answer. She wants everyone to calm down before talking again. That almost made me laugh. Of course she did. Contain the damage first. Then reshape the narrative. Ethan opened the refrigerator without seeming to know why. Just stood there staring into it. Finally, he closed it again. "I know tonight was awful." I folded my arms. "You keep talking like weather happened to us." His eyes shut briefly. "That's not fair." There it is again. He sat down slowly at the kitchen island. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock above the stove ticked louder than usual. Then he said quietly, "You don't understand what she's been under lately." I stared at him. And there it was. The thing underneath all of this. Not whether he believed me. Whether he still needed me to protect her feelings. "She publicly accused me of cheating on you." She was scared. Of what? He rubbed both hands down his face hard. The trust. I waited. My grandfather's estate gets reviewed next month. There are provisions about bloodline succession for the lake house and investment accounts. I blinked slowly. You're telling me your mother mailed our child's DNA to a lab because of real estate? It's not just real estate. Number. His voice dropped lower. She found old letters after Dad died. That made me stop. Ethan rarely talked about his father. Robert Bennett had died 4 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. Fast, brutal. The kind of illness that removes people before anyone adjusts emotionally. Ethan stared at the counter while speaking. She thinks Grandpa may have known I wasn't biologically his. I didn't move. He changed parts of the trust before he died. Mom thought. Ethan swallowed hard. She thought maybe he left things untouched because nobody else knew. And now she's afraid somebody will. He nodded once. The kitchen felt very quiet after that. Not calmer, just clearer. I leaned against the counter. So she needed someone else to look suspicious first. Ethan didn't answer. That was answer enough. I walked to the sink and turned the faucet on for no reason. Cold water rushed over my fingers. I kept staring at it. You know what's strange? I said finally. What? I spent years trying to make your mother comfortable around me. Ethan looked exhausted. I know. No, I don't think you do. My voice cracked slightly then. Just once. I thought if I was patient enough eventually she'd see me as family. He looked down immediately. That hurt too. Because he still couldn't fully look at what happened. People think betrayal feels explosive. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just realizing the person beside you watched you work very hard for something they already knew you'd never receive. Ethan stood up slowly. Claire. I stepped back before he could touch me. Not dramatically. Just enough. The movement landed harder than yelling would have. He froze. I could see the moment he understood something had changed. Not temporarily. Not fixable with one conversation. Actually changed. Upstairs, Henry coughed once in his sleep through the baby monitor. I wiped my wet hands on a dish towel. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since dinner. How long ago did she order the test? Ethan didn't answer right away. Too long. January. I stared at him. It was April. I couldn't sleep beside him after that. I tried. Around 2 a.m, I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, while Ethan breathed unevenly beside me, not fully asleep either. The room smelled faintly like his cologne and laundry detergent. Normal smells. Married smells. That almost made it worse. Finally, I got up and took my pillow into the guest room downstairs. Ethan followed me halfway down the hall. Claire. I kept walking. Can we please not do this tonight? I turned then. The hallway light hit one side of his face, leaving the other in shadow. Do what? This. He gestured vaguely between us. Pull away. I stared at him for a second. You let your mother investigate me for 4 months. She wasn't investigating you. I actually laughed. Quietly. That's your defense. His shoulders dropped a little. I was trying to keep things from escalating. That's not what happened. He rubbed both hands over his face. You think I don't know that now? The thing about Ethan was he always wanted realization to count as action. Like understanding harm should somehow soften it. I shifted the pillow higher against my chest. Did you ever think she might be wrong? Of course. But not enough to stop it. His mouth tightened immediately. There it was again. That little flicker of guilt he couldn't fully hide anymore. I opened the guest room door. Claire, please. I stopped without turning around. Then I asked quietly, did you ever doubt me? Long silence. Too long. I closed the door before he answered. The next morning, I woke up still wearing yesterday's sweater. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin stripes across the carpet. For a second I forgot where I was. Then I heard Ethan moving around upstairs. Cabinets opening, coffee grinder running. Careful noises, like someone trying not to spook an injured animal. I stayed downstairs longer than necessary. Around 8, Henry came wandering into the guest room, dragging a stuffed dinosaur by the tail. Mommy sleepover. I smiled despite myself. Something like that. He climbed into bed beside me without asking permission first. Warm little body, messy hair. Children trust you completely until somebody teaches them not to. That thought stayed with me all morning. Ethan had already made coffee when I finally walked into the kitchen. He looked relieved, just seeing me. That bothered me too. Like survival had become the goal instead of honesty. "There's toast," he said carefully. I nodded once. Neither of us mentioned the guest room. Henry sat at the island eating strawberries while kicking the cabinet rhythmically with his heels. The ordinariness of it felt surreal. Ethan poured coffee into my mug exactly the way I liked it. Tiny splash of cream. No sugar. Muscle memory. I watched him do it, and suddenly remembered another morning 3 years earlier. I'd gotten passed over for a promotion at the medical office where I worked. A younger man got it instead. I came home humiliated and embarrassed for caring so much. Ethan made me coffee that night too. Then he said, "Maybe it's not a bad thing. Less pressure if we have kids." At the time I thought he was comforting me. Now I wondered whether he'd already started imagining a life where I stayed smaller because it made everything easier. "Mom called again," he said quietly. I came back to the room. "What does she want?" "She says she'd like to apologize." I looked at him over the rim of my mug. "For which part?" He didn't answer. The kitchen got quiet again except for Henry humming to himself. Finally, Ethan sat down across from me. "I know you think I failed you." I stared at him. "Think." Another careful word. "You did." His eyes lowered immediately. Not defensive this time. Just tired. I kept hoping it would disappear. That's not how people work. I know. But that is how your family works. He leaned back slowly in his chair. And for the first time since all this started, he didn't argue with me. That scared me more than if he had. Because acceptance meant recognition. Recognition meant he'd probably known pieces of this for years. I set my mug down carefully. "Did your father know?" Ethan looked up sharply. "What?" "About you." His jaw tightened hard enough that I could see the muscle move. "I don't know. But you suspect he did." Silence. Then, maybe. I watched him stare at the countertop instead of me. "You loved him." I did. And now? That question stayed between us for a while. Finally, Ethan spoke without lifting his head. "I don't know what's real anymore." There it was. The center of it. Not money. Not inheritance. Identity. I suddenly saw how terrified he actually was. Not of losing property. Of losing history. Men like Ethan were raised to believe family names meant something permanent, stable, reliable. Now his own mother had shattered that with one envelope. And somehow, she still expected him to protect her from consequences. The phone buzzed on the counter. "Diane." Again. Ethan stared at the screen without touching it. I noticed his hand shaking slightly. First time I'd ever seen that. "You should answer," I said. "I don't want to." I almost felt sorry for him then. Almost. But sympathy and trust are not the same thing. He finally picked up the phone. "Mom." Pause. "No, she's here." Longer pause. His eyes flicked toward me briefly. Then away. "I'm not discussing this over the phone." Another pause. His shoulders stiffened. "No, you don't get to say that." I looked up immediately. Ethan rarely spoke sharply to anyone, especially Diane. He stood slowly from the table and walked farther into the kitchen. Henry kept eating strawberries completely unaware. I said no, Ethan said quietly. You already did enough. Something shifted inside me hearing that. Not repair. Not relief. Just the first crack in a structure I'd thought was permanent. Ethan listened another few seconds. Then finally he said exhausted, Mom, I'm starting to think Dad knew. The house went completely silent after that. Even Henry stopped kicking the cabinet. After Ethan said it out loud, things got quieter. Not better. Just stripped down. Like everybody had finally run out of softer versions. He hung up without saying goodbye. Then he stood there holding the phone in his hand while the coffee machine clicked softly behind him. I watched him for a second. You never used to speak to her like that. His eyes stayed on the floor. She used to make more sense to me. I didn't answer. Because I knew what he really meant. She used to make more sense before her fear collided with his. Henry asked for more strawberries. The sound nearly startled both of us. Ethan moved immediately grateful for something simple to do. He opened the refrigerator and washed strawberries carefully under cold water, while our son swung his legs against the cabinet again. Regular life kept interrupting the disaster. That was the strangest part of the whole week. The trash still needed taking out. People still emailed about preschool registration. The pharmacy still texted reminders. Nobody pauses the world because your marriage suddenly looks different in daylight. 3 days later, I went back to work. Not because I felt ready. Because staying home with Ethan felt worse. The medical office smelled like printer toner and burnt coffee exactly the same as always. Linda from reception hugged me too long and whispered, "You okay, honey?" I knew immediately Diane had started talking. Not openly. She'd never be that reckless. But wealthy suburban women spread information the way perfume spreads through a room. Quietly. Intentionally. Everywhere. I'm fine, I said. Linda gave me a look that said she didn't believe me, but respected the lie. At lunch, I sat alone in my car instead of the break room. Halfway through eating yogurt, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Claire. Diane. Her voice sounded smaller somehow without an audience. Yes. A pause. I was hoping we could meet. I stared through the windshield at rainwater sliding down the parking lot. For what? I think some things should be discussed privately. I nearly laughed. Now she wanted privacy. After performing my humiliation in front of 8 people. I'm working. What about tomorrow morning? You can say whatever you need to say now. Long silence. Then, I don't think you understand the position I was in. There it was. Not apology. Explanation. I closed my eyes briefly. What position was that exactly? Another pause. Finally, she said quietly, "Fear makes people behave badly." That sentence stayed with me. Because it was the first honest thing she'd said. The next morning I met her anyway. Part of me wanted to hear what she'd sound like without a dining table between us. We met at a cafe near the hospital district, where she used to chair fundraising committees. The kind of place with tiny ceramic cups and women in expensive sneakers discussing kitchen renovations. Diane was already seated when I arrived. Perfect posture as always. But she looked older than I remembered. Not weaker. Just tired in a way wealth can't really hide. A tea sat untouched in front of her. I took the chair across from her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she folded and unfolded her napkin once, before saying, "Thank you for coming." I nodded. That was all. She looked around briefly before lowering her voice. I handled things poorly. Poorly. Again with the careful language. I waited. She stared into her tea. When Robert got sick, he started changing paperwork. I said nothing. At first I assumed it was estate planning. Then after he passed, I found letters. What kind of letters? Old ones. That answer irritated me immediately. You brought me here to be vague. Her eyes lifted to mine then. First direct eye contact she'd really held with me in years. They were from a man I knew before Robert. The cafe noise blurred around us for a second. Dishes, espresso machine, someone laughing too loudly near the counter. Diane smoothed one finger along the rim of her cup. Ethan was born 7 months after Robert and I reconciled. I leaned back slowly. And you thought Robert knew? I think he suspected. The words came out tight. Controlled. Like they physically hurt her to admit. And the trust. She gave a small nod. Robert's father cared very much about bloodlines. Of course he did. Families with money always found elegant language for ownership. Diane looked down again. When discussions started about restructuring assets for Henry eventually, she swallowed once. I panicked. You panicked at me. Her mouth tightened. Yes. Finally. A real answer. I watched her carefully across the table. She wasn't crying. Diane probably hadn't cried in public since the Reagan administration. But I could see strain around her mouth now, around her eyes. You know the worst part, I asked quietly. She looked up. I actually spent years feeling sorry for you. That surprised her. I could tell. I thought you were lonely, I continued. I thought maybe that's why you needed so much control. She looked away immediately. Outside the cafe window, people hurried past, holding umbrellas against cold spring rain. Finally, she said softly, You think very little control exists once a family's reputation starts cracking. I stared at her, and suddenly I understood something ugly. Women like Diane survived by staying indispensable to systems built by men. Marriage, money, social standing, foundations, country clubs. One mistake could exile you from all of it. So they learned to manage perception before emotion, even if it meant destroying somebody softer nearby first. I did love Robert, she said quietly. I believed her. That was the tragedy. Nothing about this was simple enough to hate cleanly. The waitress came by asking if we needed anything else. Neither of us answered quickly enough. Finally, Diane shook her head. The waitress left. Diane tore a sugar packet slowly into tiny pieces without using any of it. Then she said almost too quietly to hear, I think Ethan hates me. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said the truest thing I could. No, I think he finally sees you. She stopped moving after that. Just sat there with torn paper between her fingers. By summer, people had mostly stopped asking questions directly. That's how communities like ours worked. Nobody wanted facts. They wanted positioning. You could feel it at school pickup, neighborhood cookouts, grocery stores. The slight hesitation before someone greeted you. The careful tone. The sudden subject changes. Not cruel exactly. Just watchful. Diane stopped hosting Sunday dinners after April. Officially, she said everyone was so busy lately. Nobody challenged it. Ethan started therapy in June. He never announced it dramatically. One Thursday evening, he came home 20 minutes late and placed a business card near his keys on the counter without realizing I'd see it. Dr. Alan Morris, Family Systems Counseling. I didn't mention it. A week later, he finally did. I've been talking to someone. I nodded once while rinsing dishes. How's that going? He leaned against the kitchen doorway. I don't know yet. That was probably the most honest answer he'd given in months. Things between us stayed careful. Not hostile. Not repaired either. We moved around each other differently now. More awareness. Less assumption. Sometimes at night, he'd reach for me in his sleep out of habit, and both of us would wake up slightly startled by it. One evening in July, he found me sitting on the back porch after Henry went to bed. The neighbors 2 houses down were setting off leftover fireworks, even though the 4th had passed days earlier. Little bursts of color over the trees. Ethan sat beside me quietly. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, Do you think I'm like her? I kept looking out at the yard. You want the nice answer or the real one? The real one. I folded my arms against the cool night air. I think you learned to survive her by becoming emotionally quiet. He nodded slowly. Not defensive. Just listening. And I think you thought being peaceful made you good. That one landed. I could tell. Because Ethan always saw himself as the reasonable person in the room. The steady one. Men like him rarely notice how often keeping the peace depends on somebody else absorbing the damage. I loved my dad, he said after a while. I looked at him then. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark yard. But I think part of me always knew something was off. He swallowed hard once. And if I admitted it, everything changed. There it was again. Identity. Inheritance wasn't just money to families like the Bennetts. It was proof. Continuity. A story people told themselves about who they were. The fireworks stopped. The silence afterward felt unusually deep. Finally, Ethan looked at me. I should have protected you. I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was more complicated now. Protection sounded different after betrayal. You should have stood beside me, I said quietly. He nodded once. Like he understood the distinction. Maybe for the first time. In August, Diane invited everyone to Henry's 4th birthday party at her house. Neutral territory, apparently. I almost didn't go. But Henry loved her. That part had never been fake. And children shouldn't have to carry adult fractures if they don't understand them yet. The afternoon felt strangely subdued from the moment we arrived. Same backyard. Same expensive outdoor furniture. Different gravity. Diane hugged Henry first thing and kissed the top of his head too many times. Then she looked at me carefully. Claire. Diane. That was it. No performance. No icy politeness either. Just caution. People spoke more carefully around me now. I noticed it immediately. Richard no longer made nervous jokes at my expense to impress Diane. Ethan's sister actually asked my opinion about preschool programs and waited for the answer. Tiny things. Tiny shifts. Power moves quietly inside families. Usually through attention. Usually through who finally gets treated like a full person. At one point during cake, Diane started correcting Henry about how to hold his fork. Instinctively. Automatically. Then Ethan interrupted her. Softly. He's okay, Mom. The table went silent for maybe 2 seconds. Diane stopped speaking immediately. Not angry. Almost startled. I realized then nobody had interrupted her in years. Not really. She looked down at her plate for a second before saying, Right, of course. And just like that, the moment passed. But not really. I felt Ethan glance toward me afterward. Not asking for credit. Maybe checking whether I noticed. I had. Later, while the kids played in the yard, I stood alone in Diane's kitchen pouring lemonade. She walked in quietly behind me. For a second, we both reached for the same dish towel. Then stopped. I heard you went back full time, she said. Yes. She nodded slowly. That's good. I looked at her carefully. A year ago, she would have framed that differently. Something about balance, or whether Henry was adjusting. Now she just said it was good. Growth sometimes sounds unimpressive from the outside. I dried my hands slowly. You don't have to monitor every conversation with me anymore. A small smile touched her mouth. I'm trying not to. That almost made me smile too. Almost. Outside, Henry was laughing loudly at something Ethan was doing with Bubbles near the patio. Diane looked toward the sound automatically. Then she said quietly, He's a very gentle father. I leaned against the counter. Yes. Another silence settled. Less sharp this time. Still careful. Diane smoothed invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth beside her. Then she asked without looking directly at me. Are you staying? I understood the question immediately. Marriage. Family. All of it. I thought about answering quickly. Instead, I watched Ethan through the kitchen window. He was crouched in the grass while Henry tried to stomp bubbles before they floated away. For the first time in months, Ethan looked fully present somewhere. Not managing tension. Not anticipating reactions. Just there. I haven't decided yet, I said honestly. Diane nodded once. And to my surprise, she accepted the answer. By the following spring, the neighborhood had mostly moved on. Or pretended to. Same thing usually. The Bennetts still hosted Easter brunch. Diane still arranged flowers too carefully. Richard still laughed too hard after 2 drinks. But something underneath the family had shifted permanently. Not broken exactly. Rearranged. I noticed it in little moments now. People waited for my answer during conversations instead of talking around me. Ethan no longer looked at his mother before making decisions. Diane interrupted less. Sometimes she even caught herself doing it. That part felt the strangest. Watching someone realize their habits in real time. Henry was 5 by then. Old enough to ask difficult questions with complete innocence. One afternoon he asked Ethan, "Why doesn't Grandma come over as much anymore?" Ethan looked toward me briefly before answering. Sometimes adults need space to learn how to do better. Henry accepted that immediately and went back to coloring. Children don't complicate things until adults teach them to. In May, Diane invited us to dinner again. Just the 3 of us this time. No audience. No buffer people. I almost said no automatically. Then I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. That changed the decision. The house looked exactly the same when we arrived. Same polished entryway. Same framed black and white family photographs lining the staircase. But the energy felt different once I stepped inside. Less performance. More awareness. Diane opened the door herself instead of having someone help prepare things in the kitchen. She wore a soft blue sweater instead of one of her structured blazers. Small detail. Still noticeable. "You made good time?" she said. Ethan handed her a bottle of wine. Henry ran straight past everybody toward the living room. The adults moved slower. Inside dinner was simpler than it used to be. Roasted chicken, salad, bread still warm from the oven. No elaborate centerpieces. No expensive candles burning like a restaurant trying to impress investors. Halfway through dinner, Henry spilled water across the table reaching for bread. A year ago, Diane would have corrected him before the glass stopped moving. This time, she just handed him a napkin. "It's okay," she said quietly. He cleaned it up himself while concentrating very hard. Nobody rushed to rescue him from embarrassment. That mattered too. Later, while Ethan helped Henry wash his hands upstairs, Diane and I stood alone in the kitchen. The dishwasher hummed softly behind us. Rain tapped against the windows. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then, Diane opened one of the drawers beside the refrigerator and pulled out an old recipe card. Yellow edges, faded handwriting. She held it carefully before passing it toward me. "My mother's lasagna recipe," she said. I looked down at the card. Tiny handwritten notes crowded the margins. Extra basil. Double foil after 30 minutes. Real use marks. Not decorative nostalgia. She used to make it every Christmas Eve, Diane said quietly. Henry might like having it someday. I looked up slowly. Her expression stayed composed, but not guarded the way it used to be. Just uncertain. Like someone offering something without knowing whether they still had the right. Years earlier, I would have taken the card as approval. An invitation. Proof I'd finally earned a place. Now it felt different. Smaller. More human than that. I accepted it gently. "Thank you." Diane nodded once. Then she looked past me toward the dark window over the sink. "I wasn't very kind to you." There it was. Not polished. Not managed. Just plain. I rested the recipe card against the counter carefully. "No," I said softly. You weren't. She swallowed once. I could tell she expected me to soften it for her. I didn't. That was another thing that changed. The silence stretched between us. Not hostile. Just honest. Finally, Diane gave a small nod, like she understood something. Then she reached for 2 clean plates beside the sink. Your husband still loads dishwashers incorrectly, she said. I smiled before I could stop myself. A real smile this time. Small, brief, but real. Upstairs, Henry laughed loudly at something Ethan said. The sound carried through the house. Diane glanced toward the ceiling automatically. Then she looked back at me. He really adores you. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to become acceptable inside this family. Quieter. Easier. More polished. More useful. I thought about the woman I was when I first sat at Diane's table, hoping patience could earn permanence. And I realized something gently, almost without pain. I had spent too much of my life confusing belonging with permission. Ethan came downstairs carrying a damp hand towel over one shoulder. Everything okay in here? I looked at him. At Diane. At the kitchen that once made me feel examined every time I entered it. Then I nodded. Yeah, I said. I think so. And for the first time I actually meant it. Not because everything healed perfectly. Not because trust fully returned to what it had been. Some things never do. But clarity has its own kind of peace. Later that night, after Henry fell asleep in the car ride home, Ethan reached over at a stoplight and took my hand carefully. Not automatically. Carefully. Like someone who finally understood it could be refused. I let him hold it. Outside the window, rain moved softly across the glass. The city lights blurred gold against the dark road ahead. If you've ever spent years shrinking yourself just to keep a room comfortable, I hope one day you stop. The end. Part 7, 982 words.